Okay, how are we all doing?
Good. Awesome.
Excellent. So welcome, guys. This is we're going to attempt to try to record this also so we can share this with a broader audience. So thank you, Andrew, for doing that. We appreciate it. Tonight is the beginning, actually, of a three-part series because it's a very important month that we don't just sort of let pass by, but we use the month. It's not the month of September. It's the month of the month of Elul, which is supposed to be a month of spiritual closeness and preparation. I don't know how many of you guys are doing the 40-day challenge, but if you would like to, you can still jump on. We have, by the way, about 1,500 people doing it. It's actually it turned out to really be a very beautiful, big thing. There's another website called Sheer Enjoyment. You get it? Sheer is like from class, Sheer Enjoyment. And there's about 800-900 people who go on every day. And a friend of mine who runs this website uploads my little 4 or 5 minute WhatsApp recording. I always say 4 or 5 minutes. It's more like 5-6 minutes. But and then puts it on there for like another 800-900 people. So it's been spreading really beautifully. And that is, Fred, come. And that is really one of the purposes of this month, is really to get prepped and to get psyched. There's an extra seat here if you'd like. I know nobody wants to sit so close to the teacher. Yeah, pull some chairs in. Is that all right? I'm stalling a little because Andrew's going to have to edit this anyway. So what I want to do with you guys tonight, next Wednesday night, what's the week? What's next Wednesday? I want to prepare you mentally for this. You're like, I just committed to tonight, Rabbi. To commit to anything for more than 1 week at a time is like a very tall order. What's next week? A week from tonight. What's the date?
14th.
The 14th. And then the week from that is the 21st. Welcome. How are you? We're bringing some... Eliashiv, you want to do me a favor?
Sure.
You want to be a real gentleman? Just bring in a couple of chairs for these... Oh, thank you, Fred. Thank you. So think like a 3-week, because I want to use what we studied tonight together to continue it next week and to continue it into the following week. I've got some more handouts if anybody would like. Do not get intimidated by all this Hebrew. If you look at the second page on the handout, you'll notice it's all English. So I'm going to be reading from both Hebrew and English, and nobody should be freaked out by too much Hebrew or anything like that. How are you? Okay. Everyone's heard of the great Rambam, Maimonides. When I read these books like Atomic Habits, has anyone read Atomic Habits by James Clear? I thought it was like a New York Times bestseller. Should like half the room be raising their hands? People at MG don't read? No?
Is that bestseller, New York Times #1 bestseller?
It is. It's like a hugely popular book. Okay, I thought it was more popular than it was. There's so much that's in that book, which is so interesting, that the great Maimonides wrote about 800-900 years ago. He lived in Spain and then later in Egypt, and he wrote a phenomenal treatise called Hilchot Deot, the laws of character traits, because he believed that character development wasn't something that simply happens. Like anything else in life, you have to work at it. Nobody tests us really on how we're doing in terms of our character and our qualities and our traits. But that's really what Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is about. Rosh Hashanah is the Day of Judgment. We're not being evaluated for how much money we made this year. We're not even being evaluated for how popular we are with other people. What we're really being evaluated on is how we deal with the challenges, the vicissitudes, the difficulties, and the opportunities and the gifts that we've been given. And in order to do that, you really have to believe in the concept of change, which is what I want to start talking to you about tonight. Do you believe, I'm asking this, that you can change? Because the way our world is going intellectually, in the world of science, as we continue to discover more and more reasons for, or causes for, different ailments, and not just physiological ailments, but mental, psychological, and emotional problems, the more likely we are to believe that we're just hardwired to be a certain way, right? I'm maybe more easily angered than somebody else, and therefore what can you expect of Wildes? He flies off the handle because he's easily angered. That's just the way God made me. And God made you this way, and God made you that way, and we have to embrace the way Hashem created us all? Or do we believe that we can actually change? And how much can we change? Is change really possible? See, if you don't believe in that, then the whole concept of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is kind of meaningless. And Maimonides was dealing with this already in his time. He lived in the 1200s in Spain. And follow along just with the opening passage. Now, if you want to do something, a little exercise, you can take this and just pop it open. Okay, and you can look at the front, which is the Hebrew, or the back in the English, whatever is more convenient. And he says in the English, free will is granted to all men. Reshut l'chol adam netuna. That if a person desires to turn himself to the path of good and be righteous, the choice is his. Should a person desire to turn his path to evil and to be wicked, the choice is his too. And that is what the Torah means in Genesis chapter 3, when God said, behold, man has become unique as ourselves. Who's God speaking to here? Man has become unique as ourselves. So the rabbis say he's talking about the angels. God was consulting with his angels, knowing good and evil, that the human species became singular and unique with no other species resembling it in what quality? That a person on his own initiative, with his own knowledge and thought, can know good and evil and do what he desires. And there's no one that can prevent him from doing good or bad. Accordingly, there was a need to drive him from the Garden of Eden, lest he stretch out his hand and take from the tree of life. What's the Rambam saying here? He's saying that you have free will. Now, why wouldn't you think you had free will? Why wouldn't you think that you have the ability to choose whatever path or course of life? I mean, there are people, I guess they were called the fatalists. A lot of Greek plays were based on fatalism. Like there's nothing you can do to change your fate. You're just sort of like some sort of actor playing out some pre-scripted role. And like you just watch these ancient Greek dramas play themselves out. Somebody was meant to die at a young age. There's nothing they could do. And then the whole play is just watching this person eventually die. Or this person is going to fail at a certain task. And that's what the Greeks really believed. And the Rambam is teaching. And the Rambam, by the way, was a student of, anybody know intellectually who the Rambam considered himself to be a student of? Aristotle. He quoted Aristotle, considered him his mentor. He didn't live at the same time, but Aristotle lived earlier. But intellectually, he very much believed in a lot of his teachings, not everything. But the Rambam here is saying that Judaism does not subscribe to this. Judaism does not believe that life's been prescripted for us. And continue, look at the second paragraph. I'm going to read it in Hebrew so you can get but you can look at the English. Al yavor b'machshavatcha davar she'omrim tipshei umot. Do not allow yourself to entertain these thoughts that the tipshim, which is not a nice word, tipesh is a fool, that the fools of the nations of the world, and many Jews among them, who believe, she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu gozer al adam mitchiat briyuto, that God decrees on a person from the very moment of his creation to be a tzaddik or a rasha. What's a tzaddik? Tzaddik is what's a tzaddik, guys? Anybody know? A righteous person, or what's the opposite of a righteous person? A rasha, a wicked person. The Rambam says you should not subscribe to this belief that when you were created, when you were brought into this world, it was already decreed what kind of person you were going to be. Ein hadavar kain, the Rambam says, this is not so. Ela kol adam ra'ui lo liot tzaddik Moshe Rabbeinu. He says something very radical. Any person can be as great as Moshe or as evil as Yeravam. Yeravam was a terrible tyrant who brought the Jewish people into idol worship. He's in the prophets. He's like the opposite of Moses. Moses brought the people into monotheism, into Torah. Yeravam brought us into a very corrupt kind of life. You can be a Moshe, you can be a Yeravam. He says you can be better than Moshe. Now, does anyone in this room believe that you can be better than Moshe? You're shaking your head, and that's what I thought originally too. But how could you be better than Moshe? The Rambam believed you could. Is there a way to explain how anyone of us sitting here, what would you say?
How are you defining better? Like better overall, or in like one aspect, or?
Meaning like there are 1,000 qualities and maybe Moshe wasn't so great in this quality and I'm better than him in that one? That's interesting. That's a possibility. What else? How could you be better than, because you started asking nicely, like what does it mean to be better? What does better mean in the back?
To be yourself.
What does that mean?
Being better than Moshe, when you're comparing yourself to Moshe, means
Good.
that you're trying to be like someone else. But to be better than someone else means to be true to who you are and be yourself.
Okay.
And live your true authenticness, whatever that is.
Right, so the goal is really not to be objectively better than Moses. It's to be closer to your own potential than Moshe got to his. Because what does it really mean to be great as far as Torah and Judaism is concerned? In our society, it means to make a certain amount of money, to have a certain level of fame, fortune, popularity. It's objective. It's subjective in Judaism. And that's what we're being evaluated on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Not how well you're doing vis-a-vis the dude sitting next to you or a woman sitting next to you in synagogue, but how close did you come to reaching your potential? And if you got closer to reaching your potential than Moses got to his, you're better than Moses. You know, it's a famous story of Rabbi Zusha on his deathbed. He was one great rabbinic sage. He was crying on his deathbed. And his students didn't understand why he was crying. He had led such a saintly life. And they said, Rabbi Zusha, famous Rabbi Zusha story, like, don't you know you're gonna be in this unbelievable place? You're gonna have a seat next to Moses himself. You're so connected to God. What are you crying about? So what did Rabbi Zusha answer famously? He says, when I get to God, to heaven, God says, why weren't you like Abraham? I can say, God, you never gave me the prophetic vision of Abraham or the traits of kindness of Abraham. And when God says, why weren't you as strong as Yitzchak, as Isaac? I could say, I didn't have those qualities like Yitzchak, like Jacob and Moses, and he keeps going on. I have no problem telling God, I'm not Moshe, I'm not Abraham, and I couldn't be Yitzchak. But when God says, Reb Zusha, why weren't you like Reb Zusha? Then what am I going to say? And that's why when Abraham was called to the Akedah to bring his beloved son Isaac, why did God repeat his name? Avraham, Avraham. Why did he say it twice? Abraham was an old man, he was hard of hearing already. He said it twice because the sages teach that each of us has two versions of ourselves. There's the earthly version, the actual, and then there's the heavenly version, the potential. And what God was really saying to Abraham was that this, and don't ask me how, because this is very difficult, the binding of Isaac is a very difficult part of the Torah, but somehow that test was supposed to help Abraham get from the earthly Abraham, the actual, to the heavenly potential Abraham. So when Maimonides here says, you could be greater than Moses, he's not saying objectively, right? He's saying in terms of your own potential. And that's all that really matters. And that is not predetermined. Problem. There is a text in the Talmud, in the oral tradition, that seems to imply that free will is not so simple. There's a big discussion today in the world of science, in psychology, in philosophy certainly, about free will. Like, can you really say that I have free will? I don't know. If I grew up in a house of all lawyers, do I have free will to become a doctor? I guess so. Is it more likely that I'll be a lawyer than a doctor? Probably. Did somebody put a gun to my head and said I can't go to medical school? No. But the likelihood is much less. We're all familiar with rags to riches stories of somebody who came to this country with not a penny in their pocket and they made a lot of money. But most people who are rich in America are that way because that's the kind of family they were born into. Not necessarily a rich family, but a family that put them on a certain trajectory and gave them certain opportunities. And we always love those stories of those individuals that defy, and somehow make it big even though they didn't. But can you really say we have free will? That we have the same opportunities as each other to really become so awesome and so great? Is that really true? And that's why a lot of people don't believe in free will or don't believe in it 100%. And there is some support for this in the Talmud. Take a look at the last source on the page. This is a passage from the Talmud. I've shared this many times. Actually, just look at the English. It's page 3. It's a very strange Gemara about an angel. Rabbi Chanina bar Papa made the following exposition. The name of the angel who's in charge of conception is Night. Very appropriate. There's a different angel for everything. And the name for the angel for conception is Lila, evening. And Lila takes a drop and places this drop before God. This drop, according to Rashi, on this passage in the Talmud, is a drop of sperm. And Layla, this angel, takes this drop of sperm and brings it before God and says, Tipazu, this drop, matehe aleha, what will become of it? Shall it produce a strong man or a weak man, a wise man or a fool, a rich man or a poor man? Stop for a minute. What's happening here? The angel's coming to God with this sperm, which it's not even it's sperm. It's not it certainly has the potential for life, but I don't think anyone would consider it life necessarily. It hasn't even fertilized the egg to form the beginnings of life. And yet the angel is saying what to God? What's going to be with this sperm that's going to eventually fertilize an egg and turn into a person? What kind of person is that person going to be? Rich or poor? Smart or foolish? Strong or weak? Now that seems to imply what? Free will? No free will. So far, it seems to like, but look at the next line. Whereas wicked or righteous, he never mentions. The angel never asks God, will this sperm develop into a person that becomes a tzaddik, a righteous person, or a evil person, God forbid? Why? Because, quotes the last line, Rabbi Chanina said that everything is in the hands of God. Kol bidei shamayim. Everything is in God's hands. Chutz mirat shamayim, except for the fear of God. What does that mean, everything is in God's hands? A lot is in God's hands. You know, no matter how much time I spend in the gym, I can bulk up and pump up. I tried this when I was about 18 or 19. I ate a crazy amount of carbs, and I spent 2-3 hours in the gym 3-4 times a week. I did this for a year and a half, and I came back bigger, stronger, but I wasn't anywhere near a friend of mine who was kind of just born that way, genetically. And I put a lot of time also in the library and studying, and I have friends I went to law school with, got smicha with at YU, who, no matter how much I studied and tried and killed myself, put in double the amount of hours of them, they always did better. I had my chavruta, my study partner at YU, we were in law school together. He never showed for any of the classes. And he did better than I did. And we're still friends. I just saw him at a wedding this week. And it annoyed me because I had to kill myself so much more and not do as well, even though I put in more time, effort. So in a sense, some of this is predetermined. How strong we are, how intelligent we are, and even, I would say, money. Again, there are exceptions to every rule, but if you look at the statistics, if you're put on a certain trajectory and you grew up in a certain family that values education, has the money to send you to college and graduate school, you're more likely to make a lot more money than people who didn't have those opportunities. You can't doubt that, and that's just the reality. So if that's what you mean by free will, we don't have it. But that's not what Judaism means by free will. Free will is not the deck of cards that's dealt to us. Free will is what we choose to do with the deck of cards. And I heard this many years ago from the late and great Esther Young Rice, of blessed memory. She ran an organization called Hineni. It was right here on the Upper West Side. And I heard her say this at a lecture. I used to go to her talks. She said, it doesn't matter whether you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, or you're a cab driver. She was talking about it doesn't matter to God. It probably matters to your parents and your family. But to God, she said, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, lawyer, or cab driver. What really matters is what?
If you're a good lawyer or doctor.
Now, what does that mean, good?
Good to people.
Right. If your values and your character in terms of the way you treat your patients, your clients, your passengers. And that's what we're being evaluated. And therefore, when we say we believe in free will, we don't necessarily believe that we all have the same opportunity. We don't. What we have the same opportunity is to deal with our deck of cards. And how we confront. Rabbi Soloveitchik used to say this, that we can't really choose the things that happen to us in life. But what we can choose is how we deal with those things. That's where we have free choice. If anybody wants to read an amazing book on this, Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor, who developed a methodology in psychoanalysis called logotherapy. He wrote that he believed that this is what Nazis, Yimach Shemam, were trying to prove in the camps. That if you take a human being, just like an animal, you can put a human being in a certain set of circumstances and you can predict their behavior. You can determine what they are going to do, just like any animal in a laboratory. And Viktor Frankl, who survived the camps and gave tremendous comfort to many people in the camps, said that every time a Jew parted with some of his meager rations for someone else, they defied what the Nazis were trying to prove. There is this very small space between stimuli and response where we get to choose. And it's in those moments that we truly express humanity, where we can be people and we can develop ourselves spiritually. And that's where we get to choose. So I want to sort of qualify the way we began class tonight, of saying Maimonides says you have free will and you can be even greater than Moshe. That means you can come even closer to your own potential than Moses did. And if you do so, you're greater than him. And B, whereas the circumstances of our lives are not fully within our control, how we deal with those circumstances are. That choice is always left to us. I'm thinking of the quote, but I don't want to mess it up. It's a really great book to read at this time, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. We still have that choice. And as long as we have that choice, we can perfect ourselves. And we can really make the best. And just be better. Maimonides says that there's really no need for Torah if you don't believe in becoming better. What's the whole point of Judaism, of the whole Torah, and all these prophets that came along to rebuke and chastise the Jewish people for not following in God's ways? If we were hardwired to live in a certain way and we had no way out of that, then why does God set us up for failure? Why does God set us up, to be able to, do this and do that? We have all these laws, 613 commandments. If we're just going to be the way He made us, and God knows what we're going to be anyway, and it's like a game. It's not a game. We get to choose whether to keep those mitzvot, how to apply those mitzvot to our lives on a daily basis, and whether or not we're going to somehow learn to grow from each of those moments, even though not everything is within our control. I want to mention one last thing. I just interviewed Gedalia Fenster. Does anybody know Gedalia Fenster? So he's in Miami, does a lot of lecturing, and he says something. I asked him today, it's not out yet, but I just interviewed him on my podcast today. And I said, what do you think is one of the big issues that is keeping a lot of people from finding happiness today? Because we're a generation that really struggles with happiness. And he said that people, he believes, and he works a lot with addicts and a lot of others that are struggling with all sorts of issues in life. And he said that there are too many people that think that life is happening to them and not for them. So I said, what do you mean? What's the difference when life's happening to you versus for you? He says, everything that happens to us is designed to help us grow in some way. But often we experience a challenge and we get so upset by it, we just feel like a victim. And this terrible thing is happening to me, as opposed to seeing it as some sort of opportunity for growth. Now, I don't recommend you share this with someone who's in the throes of depression or God forbid going through a family member that is ill, this is an opportunity for you to grow. You do not want to say that to your friend while they're going through it. Somebody today called me, was really not in a good place, and I was just there listening, trying to be an active, loving supporter and listener. But in a couple of days, I'm going to call the person back and ask them, how do you think this circumstance, which is really difficult, that you're having a really hard time overcoming, how do you think you can somehow grow from this experience in your life? Because life doesn't happen to us, life happens for us. And God's not out to get us. God's out to help us grow. And that's why every single circumstance and situation in which we find ourselves is really an opportunity for growth. Okay, any comments or questions? I'm lecturing and talking way too much here. Questions, comments? Yeah, Chloe.
Daniel lost his son this year.
Oh, he did not mention that.
Yeah, so I think it's really incredible when you hear his classes from that perspective. I mean, he's always been very inspiring, but
Wow.
going through something like that, still being able to say that. is nice.
I did not know that. You did not share that. Wow. I mean, all the more power to him then. So, yeah.
Question. So when you said the highest potential of a person, so how do the person know what their highest potential is?
You have to push yourself. How do you know how much weight you can lift in a gym? How do you know when you're taking on too much? You're going to crash and burn. You're going to really hurt yourself. It's a very fine line because, and we said this on the podcast, you know, in order to build muscle, you have to tear tissue. So if it's too pleasant of an experience, it'll be very nice and lovely, but you won't have accomplished anything, or at least the reason for going to the gym. You could have just met a friend for coffee and had a pleasant experience too. But you went to the gym either to lose some weight or to build up some muscle. So how do you know? You have to push yourself a little and see how it feels. And you'll know when you feel you're doing too much, when you feel you're taking on too much. And that's why you need a trainer also. Because a good trainer will be able to say, you know, I think 7 or 8 reps of this, you know, 5 this, 6 of that, 3 of this. Somebody who understands the weight situation, how the body works, and can evaluate your potential. Mentors are really important for spiritual growth. And but also testing yourself a little, so you can figure out how far can I go. The other thing that James Clear keeps talking about, and I'll get to this soon, in his Atomic Habits, is becoming happy with small steps. See, the reason most of us don't stick with things long enough to see results is because we don't see results. See, if you saw results quickly, you would keep at it. The problem is, results don't happen overnight. You need to have some faith that I'm putting in the effort, just do it, done, come back the next day, put it in again, keep doing it. Because small incremental steps have, like in the stock market or in your savings, they, what's the word? What's that? They appreciate in value, but there's a different word I'm looking for. What's that? Compounding, that's the word. Right? It compounds over the years. And if you're a consistent, let's say, saver, you don't have to save a crazy amount of money, but if you look, it's all over YouTube. If you save, like, I know sometimes they're a little ridiculous. If you save 50 cents a day, okay, it doesn't really add up to so much. But if you save $12 a day and you put the $12 a day after the year, it's this amount. And then the second year, it's compounding. I'm not a person in the world of economics, but it's unbelievable what happens after 10 years or after 15 years. But since you don't see a lot of growth in a short period of time, we lose faith. But it makes a big, big difference. He gives another very good metaphor in the book. He says, if you're flying a plane, I'm sure there are many pilots in the room, probably not. So what happens if you turn the nose of the plane when you take off ever so slightly? It's negligible. But the difference between when you keep doing that over a certain period of time, instead of ending up in New York City, you'll end up in Washington. Okay, a small change incrementally results in a big result. But you have to stay in the game. By the way, you know how I know this is true? Because I heard it on Oprah many, many years ago. And everything Oprah says is true, of course. But she brought on I'm a big fan, actually. I didn't mean to say negative things about Oprah. Overall, I'm a big fan. She brought on a guy who wrote his doctoral dissertation on the four blue zones. Have I shared this? You know, the blue zones in 4 parts of the world where people live to an incredibly old age. And this guy did his PhD doctoral thesis, and there are a couple of common denominators. They have certain diets. They all work till they drop. There's no retirement for people really old. People live to like 106, 107, 108. One of the things she said was they all prayed. But, she said, based on his research, praying consistently. If you dabble in prayer and you pray once in a while when you're in the mood, it doesn't prolong your life. It's not associated with longevity, prayer. Prayer only becomes associated with longevity when you pray consistently. Even if it's not a long period of time every day, but it's every day. That actually moves the needle. Now, I want to shift a little, and this is where we're going to go for the next 2 weeks. We're just going to kick it off tonight. And that is, how do we learn how to perfect our personalities and improve our traits? It's nice to say I want to be better, I want to be closer to a tzaddik than, God forbid, the opposite. And it's nice to say that I have free will to do this, but what do you study? What part of Judaism should you study to improve your personality? Anybody know? Is there any text, or is there any specific? I know you came to a class to do that. Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, good. That's one book. There's actually a lot. So I want to give you a little history, and then we're going to end with this, and then we're going to tackle. We're going to jump into this in the next 2 weeks. I'll tell you a story. There's a true story that happened in Brisk. Brisk was a town in Eastern Europe, and these 2 Jews once passed away on the same day in Brisk. And it was in the morning that a poor shoemaker died, lived his life in relative obscurity. And later on during the day, in the afternoon, a very wealthy, sort of big philanthropist in the town died. Now, what's the halacha when it comes to the Chevra Kadisha? You guys know what a Chevra Kadisha is? The burial society. It's supposed to tend to the body and wash the body in the waters of the mikvah. It's called the tahara. Dress the body in the tachrichim, in the shrouds. Bury, do the whole thing. There's only one Chevra Kadisha in the town. Who do they go to first? Who should they tend to first? Whoever dies first. Because according to Jewish tradition, you're not permitted to let a body just lie around. That's why you see traditionally Jewish funerals take place very quickly after the person has passed. In Israel, they bury literally the same day, because it's considered to be disrespectful to the body to let the body just sort of hang out. The Chevra Kadisha, though, went to the home of the wealthy person, and they started tending to his needs before the person who died first, who was poor. And Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, this is the grandfather of the Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who you always hear me quote. He was the chief rabbi in this place. His name was Reb Chaim of Brisk, and he was a huge, huge Torah scholar. I actually got to visit his grave. He's buried in Warsaw, and we brought a group to Poland years ago for MGE, and we went to see his grave. Anyway, he got very upset when he heard about this, and he was very elderly at the time, and he took his walking stick and he personally trudged over to the house of the wealthy man, and he kicked out the burial society, the Chevra Kadisha, from the home, and prevailed upon the group to attend to the poor man's needs first. Not because he was poor, but because the tradition is whoever dies first. And that was the same Reb Chaim who, when he was once asked what the job of a rabbi is, he said, and I quote, "To look out for those who have been abandoned or alone, to protect the dignity of the poor, and to save the oppressed." And when I got to see his tombstone, you know what it said on top? It says it on top. Most people, when you ask about Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who have gone to yeshiva and studied his works, they'll know Reb Chaim was like, he revolutionized Talmud study. I would say discovered, but he originated a very scientific, almost mathematical way to study the Talmud, which his grandson, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, brought to these shores and ordained over 2,000 rabbis and taught them this approach. And most people think he was just intellectually a genius, which he was. But you know what it says on the top of his tombstone? It says Rav Chesed. What's Chesed? Kindness, the rabbi of kindness. Because when people die, they get remembered for usually the kind things. Not just if they were smart and they were, brilliant scholars, but the good that we do for other people. And the greatness of Reb Chaim was not just these stories, it's the fact that he was related by his grandson, that he was not by nature a person of generous spirit. He was someone that struggled with this. We all sometimes think about these great rabbis as like they were born this way. It's not true. There were a lot of rabbis, including the Chafetz Chaim, who was Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan, who lived in Radin, Poland in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The stories of his students coming into his synagogue late at night, who saw the Chafetz Chaim prostrated on the floor, crying out to God for help, to help him deal with his anger issues. Now, I'm sure his anger issues and my anger issues are in two different worlds. But he was not by nature, and Rav Nachman of Breslov, some of you have heard of the Breslovers, walking around always so happy and cheerful. The founder of the Breslov movement, Rav Nachman, also said he struggled with these issues. And it was always assumed that if you learned enough Torah and you followed enough mitzvos, you would become a more ethically refined person. And it makes sense, because if you're following the Torah says, love your neighbor as yourself. And if you're following the Torah, then you're not supposed to speak ill of your neighbor. And if you're following the Torah, you should be doing A, B, and C. But if you don't study these areas, and the rabbis in the 1800s started to see that although a lot of people spent a lot of time in yeshiva, learning the Talmud and becoming like experts on Jewish law, some of them were still not being refined in terms of their ethics and their character. And I'm sure everyone here has met someone who's a very orthodox religious person who doesn't seem to have a terribly well-refined character. It exists. Maybe you were at a kiddush and they pushed and shoved you to get to the cholent before you got there. I don't know, maybe you had some negative experience with someone who ostensibly looks like a very religious Jew, but doesn't seem to be very kind or sensitive in the way. Now, you can't judge a book by its cover. A lot of people think that about Israelis. Right? An Israeli, I always make this joke, like a bus driver is the last guy to say hello, good morning when you walk on the bus. He's a little gruff. But he's also the first guy to put the bus into park when he sees a woman coming on the bus with a carriage, with a baby carriage. You don't see that in New York City. You will see many times a very kind, courteous bus driver who wishes you a good morning, but is not going to do, so it's important not to judge a book by, somebody might be in action a very courteous, sensitive person, but not come off that way. But some people may not be either, even if they spent many years learning in yeshiva. And this is not a new phenomenon. Rabbi Yisrael Misalant was a young rabbi in Lithuania in the 1800s, and he saw that many people were maintaining their Torah commitment in the face of poverty, anti-Semitism, persecution, but they were losing their emotional connection to Judaism's inner meaning and ethical core. And he began introducing what's called, I want you to know this word, it's called Musar. Musar. Musar just means instruction, but if you went into any yeshiva and you say, I'm here to give you a little Musar, the students are probably like, uh-oh, this is when the rabbi is going to get all like fire and brimstone. You start telling me what a miserable person I am, blah, blah, blah. It's not about being told what a miserable person. It's really about being told what a great person you are and the unbelievable potential you have. See, there's two ways of improving. One way is by beating yourself up a little, and I'm such a garbage person, I'm like, doesn't usually work. The other way is to see how much potential you have. Because remember when your parents were a little disappointed in your behavior? It was probably more effective when they would take the tact, when they would take the approach of like, I don't understand, you're such a well-behaved, you're such a good kid. Why would you do such a thing? As opposed to, you miserable child. Those are two different ways of dealing with it. And that's Musar just the same. Now, there were Jews who always studied texts having to do with ethics and personality, but what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter did was to get these Torah sources woven into the fabric of the yeshiva curriculum, so they would be a systematic way of approaching ethical development, just like anything else. I'm just curious, has anyone here ever taken a class? And I don't mean a class on the philosophy of ethics. I mean like a class on how to be better. It's ridiculous. We take classes on everything. We read books on everything. We listen to podcasts on virtually every topic in the world. But to actually be a better person, a kinder, more sensitive individual to our fellow human being and more connected to our spiritual source. And even within the Jewish community, those classes were not really well fleshed out. You just like sit at the Talmud class and maybe you pick up little pieces here and there. And again, it was just assumed you learn enough Talmud, you study enough Bible, you're going to be better. It doesn't always work that way. Like anything else needs to be thought out, there needs to be curricula. And so what I'm looking forward with you guys to do over the next 2 weeks is to help realize our potential, see if we can be maybe like Moses, maybe not better than Moses, but getting as close to our potential as possible by studying some texts. And I want to focus on Maimonides, because Maimonides had this incredible treatise he wrote called Hilchos Deot. It's about 9 or 10 chapters, and it's the laws of character traits. And we're going to go through them, because he fleshes them out. We're going to start with anger next week. We're going to talk about why we get angry, and how to curb our anger, and how to understand it not only from a psychological, emotional perspective, but really a spiritual perspective. What does it really mean? What are we really doing when we're getting angry and upset with people? And how do we deal with situations that legitimately upset and anger us? And there are times when you have to really display anger. Because if you let your kids run into the street and you don't show them you're upset because you've overcome your anger issues, they're going to run into the street again. And if you keep letting people at work walk all over you because you don't display any disappointment or anger at them, then that's so it's there for a reason. The question is, how do you navigate it and how do you develop it in the right way? I want to speak about also the issue of jealousy, which I think has been exacerbated through social media. I don't mean like angry jealousy and getting back at people. That's called revenge. That's not so common. I'm talking about the internal kind of jealousy that many of us experience and how we can process that. And similarly, all of these kinds of approaches. I'm going to give this to you. It's another little handout for you to read for next week, because the Rambam was a student of Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, who believed in, what was Aristotle known for? The golden mean. What was the golden mean? Extremes are bad, middle of the road is good. Now you're in middle of the road and someone else's middle of the road might be in very different places. So we're going to have to talk about what's the Jewish middle of the road when it comes to these traits. Maimonides believed that everything the Torah prescribed was the middle of the road approach. And that is the trait or the quality that is equidistant between the two extremes. So someone, for example, who gets angry, who's too easily angered, everything angers him. And then what's the opposite of somebody who gets too easily angered? He says like a dead person. It's like you do anything and this person has no reaction. That's also bad. Then you have no integrity. So we're supposed to somehow find the middle. Now different situations will I guess inspire us to try to find what the middle path is, and we're gonna jump into that. I'm just gonna pass this around. If I didn't, I have a lot here. Just grab one, and just take it home and read it. And what I want to do for you with you guys next week is is jump into. We're going to talk about anger, and there's also a really amazing letter that not Maimonides, but Nachmanides, not to confuse the two rabbis. Nachmanides also lived in Spain, was a very different thinker than the Rambam. He was a Kabbalist, and I want you to read his letter that he wrote to his son. He wrote this to his eldest son when he left the home with the instruction to read it every week. And it's called the Igeret HaRamban. It's a very famous, beautiful letter. It's on the back of this packet. So if you do a little homework, over the weekend. We'll pick up next week. But any other comments or questions about anything I've mentioned here? About the history of the Mussar movement, studying texts that are focused specifically on ethical development. Any comments, questions? Yeah.
I just have a question about this line on the last page in the first heading.
Yes.
Everything is in the end of heaven except for the fear of God.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen that line a lot recently, and I don't fully understand the last part, the fear of God part.
Yeah, so the fear of God is really, it's a certain phrase. In Hebrew, it's called Yirat Shamayim. Yirat Shamayim doesn't mean that every time somebody mentions God's name, you start quaking in your boots, like I'm afraid of God. The fear of God means that you recognize the awesomeness of God. You have a certain reverence for God. Now, there's two levels of reverence for God. There's the fear reverence. There's the fear level. Like a child. The child could listen to his or her parents for one of two reasons. Either they're afraid of what's going to happen if they don't. Mommy and daddy are going to scream, yell, or punish me. That's a very low level of fear. The higher level is, I believe that my parents know more than I do. They're smarter than me, they're wiser, and they have my best interests at heart. That's all with it. By the way, none of that is loving God. It has nothing to do with loving your parents. The highest level is really love. But when it talks about fear of God here, it's talking about a certain reverence for God. Now, it could either refer to, I'm afraid of what's going to happen if I don't follow God's word. That's a lower level. Or it could be like, I recognize where God is, who I am in relation to God. So what does it mean that everything is in God's hands except for the fear of God? The fear of God really is your value system, because we believe our values come from God, expressed in the Torah. So everything is in God's hands. What you look like, your strength, your weakness, just what we were talking about before, how smart, not so smart, all that stuff has been predetermined to a large degree, except for my values. How am I going to deal with those circumstances? How am I going to deal with my strength or my relative weakness? How am I going to deal with my smarts or not so smart? How am I going to deal with having, every situation? The Ramchal, another great rabbi I'm going to be relying on in the next 2 weeks, he wrote that, people think that the only people who are tested are like people who have unfortunate situations, like poor people. But rich people, they got blessings. Poor people, they're being tested. The Ramchal said that poor people are tested to see if they can learn to somehow be sameach b'chelko, be satisfied with the little they have. And a rich person is tested to see whether or not they become indifferent to the plight of the poor. They're both tested. And I don't know how well a rich person or a poor person does. And of course, by the way, we always pray that we should be tested with wealth. But we shouldn't think that only people with unfortunate circumstances are being tested. In fact, you could argue from our world, which test is harder to pass? If you take 100 poor people and 100 rich people in America, put them in a room and see how they're doing with their respective tests. So everything is in God's hands except for the fear of God, meaning everything, circumstances of life are pretty much out of our hands. But not the way we deal with it, not the values that I apply to that, not the attitude I take. That's the fear of heaven. It's a much broader term than just I'm afraid of God. I appreciate you asking that. I kind of fluffed over that. What's your first name again? Karen? Carolyn, okay, thank you. Great. Any other comment, questions, challenges? What's everyone doing for the high holidays? Around? You here? Here? Awesome. We're going to have beautiful Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. What I'm hoping also is that this is going to help us prepare. And what I'd like to do is also in the next 2 weeks is bring in a couple of things from the liturgy, from the prayers actually of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, that sort of connect from all of this. By the way, I just want to mention one last thing. I mentioned this before. James Clear says this in his Atomic Habits, but Rabbi Yisrael Misalant wrote this too, a couple hundred years ago. The one who started the Mussar movement, he said that he always encouraged his readers not to give up when they don't see improvement from their work, when they don't see that difference, because differences are happening. Change is happening. Just because you don't see it or feel it doesn't mean it's not happening. A lot of people will say, Rabbi, I prayed, I didn't feel anything. I said, well, that's not great, because you should try to feel something. It's called service of the heart. But that doesn't mean nothing happened. You just spoke to God, and you had a connection with Hashem. The fact that you didn't really feel that so much doesn't mean that that was a waste of your time. And if you study Kabbalah, there's all this stuff happening on the cosmic, metaphysical level that we're not even attuned to. It's almost like, you ever get one of those dog whistles and you blow it and you don't hear anything, but like the dogs are going crazy? Because they're hearing something you're not. There's stuff going on. Now you need some faith to believe in that if you don't see it yourself. But that's one of the, that's I think one of the, and Rabbi Wildes was a great contemporary rabbi, says that the greater challenge and breakdown in society, the more important it is to hold on to these things on a daily basis. Especially when you're being encouraged to perform activities that are a little more countercultural. Judaism, religion in general, has become a little more countercultural in our society. It's become like the norm not to be observant, not to be a believer. We kind of made fun of for that today. It takes a lot of faith to just stay at it and maintain your level of conviction, because you believe that you actually get it better. Of course, it's very encouraging when you see it, but you stick with it long enough, please God, we can do this. One last thing I'll mention before we finish, and that is the idea of hitbonenut, which is the ability to self-reflect. And Rabbi Wildes wrote that you may not be that smart, you may not have that much talent, but everyone has the ability to self-reflect. That's really what it means to be a human being. Animals, by definition, do not have the consciousness to self-reflect. They can enjoy things in the physical world, but they can't look at their own lives and evaluate. We get to do that. That's what separates us from the animals. And that's ultimately what enables us to improve. But I forgot who said this, that the unexamined life, help me fill it in. It's a famous quote. You can Google it after class. The unexamined life is...
Not worth living.
What is that? Not worth living? Yeah. It's a great line. Soren Kierkegaard. The unexamined life is something or other. What's that?
The unexamined life
is not worth living. Yeah, so that's really what this time on the calendar is about, and that's what we're going to be diving into in the next couple of weeks. The other thing is, just to take a look, we're going to talk about anger next week, and we'll hit some other qualities and personality traits, and I'm going to have some other sources for you besides this. Either I was really clear and everyone understood everything, or you just, no other comments or questions.
It was great, thank you.